You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
On helping wounded warriors. Those we send to war often come back changed. Some veterans take time to readjust to the home front. I know I certainly did. Others return broken by physical and mental injuries. The issues affecting modern veterans are not necessarily new. Pompey and Caesar campaigned on veterans' issues. If these issues are not new, how is the wider Australian society addressing them? What support is required for those broken, but not defeated, by war? Today, I'm sitting in the CEO's office of the Australian charity Soldier On. Don't worry, they do know that I'm in here, because today I'm hoping to answer some of those questions about veterans and how society can support them. My guest today is John Bale. John is a former Australian Army officer with 12 years' experience and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. In 2012, he co-founded the charity Soldier On in response to the issues he was seeing amongst modern veterans. John, thanks for letting me into the building and coming on the show for a chat.
Mate, absolute pleasure, as we discussed in the preamble. Always happy to have a fellow Tasmanian here in the building.
That's right, listeners. I was able to locate another Tasmanian in Canberra. Actually, there's quite a few Tasmanians in Canberra, and we all get together for a family barbecue every now and then. Now, John, you were still serving when you began Soldier On. Can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your service?
So I joined up in 2002 and came from country New South Wales up in Armidale. Decided that with a long history of army service, it's something that I also wanted to follow in my father, grandfather's footsteps and do something that I felt was more than just a job. Did 12 years in, I was a signals officer. Through that process, went to ADFA, graduated, done Troon, then went back and did honours and continued through, held the usual command appointments and went and did short trips over to Afghanistan in 2008 and 2010. Through that process, recognised that there was an opportunity to support those who were coming back affected and impacted by their service, and had been really inspired by Help for Heroes and organisations like that, and wanted to do something more. And that really hit home when a good mate of mine, Mike Fussell, was killed in 2008 on 27th of November. And his family got this incredible amount of support. The society that got behind him from an army perspective, from his mates and from the entire Armidale and therefore national community was incredible. But there were other guys that were wounded in the same incident, both physically and subsequently psychologically. And there was no organisation to really build that community support for them, because ultimately we all become ex-soldiers, ex-sailors and ex-Air Force men and women, and there comes a time when you have to come back in that community. If the community doesn't understand what you've been through, especially if you've been impacted by your service, then how can they support you through that period? We've been, as I said, inspired by Help for Heroes and other organisations and wanted to do something like that here. My wife, who's a psychologist, and a good mate of mine, Cavan, decided that, you know, enough of talking about this around the mess and as you do, trying to fix the world's issues, why don't we do something about it and have a crack? And hey, if it didn't come to anything, at least we could say we tried.
It's an interesting story that, you know, through personal experience, professional service, and a level of, I suppose, a deeper level of frustration trying to understand how these issues can be sorted. And you know, it sounds like it was a personal journey at the start for the three of you starting off Soldier On. Helping the organisation that you worked for was a big step. However, we do see that there are plenty of advocacy groups at the moment around. Is it that there was a gap in the market for the aims that Soldier On was trying to reach? We do make mention of Help for Heroes, which for those listeners who are not UK based, Help for Heroes is a very large charity similar to Soldier On is in Australia, and it is about helping those wounded warriors transition and recover. So I guess my question is, what was the gap, and where do you see Soldier On fitting into this network of veteran support?
So when we started, the gap that we recognised was, I guess, from a personal perspective of a lack of community to support those coming back impacted by service, and importantly also their families. Now, we didn't start on the family approach, but we recognised when we went through, and I think that's over the last 4 years the organisation has changed. So maybe I'll take you through that original gap and how we've changed and how we're meeting the need as it is. So when we started, it was very much about building a community, and we realised the first real phase of that was to build awareness that, in fact, most of the community didn't understand what was happening in Afghanistan. They hadn't understood what was happening in Iraq. Even East Timor seemed to be something that we had limited understanding of, let alone our peacekeeping operations from the 1990s, which people are still around in society today, carrying those impacts of what happened there, and also the good parts of what happened as well. So there needed to be community awareness. Now, I was at the time still working in Defence and in Army at Headquarters Joint Operations Command. And what I saw, and what Cavan and the rest of the guys that were working there saw, was a disconnect between everything that was happening around the ADF and what we were involved in and what the Australian public was seeing. So when we were trying to identify that there were issues, there's PTSD, operational stress, anxiety, depression, but just the general concept of what service is, there didn't seem to be a good understanding. There were caricatures of what a veteran is, and to be frank, many of them actually were more about what you learnt from World War I and World War II history books than actually what a modern veteran was. So really, the first thing we did is an awareness-based program to get people to understand what it is that a veteran goes through, and also some of the impacts of going to Afghanistan, East Timor, Iraq, but also border protection, training accidents, etc., and just the general concept of service. I guess the biggest thing, our breakout moment, if you will, from an organisational perspective, was the South Pole. We took 2 veterans that were still serving at that time in partnership with the Australian Army and Walking with the Wounded, with Prince Harry back to the South Pole after they did the North Pole the year prior. That was a fantastic opportunity to highlight, and obviously the Prince brings a lot of media attention, to highlight that this was just not an issue isolated to the UK or US. This is actually something that all forces in the coalition that have been to Afghanistan had impacts from that service, but not just from that service, from all the other conflicts and training that I spoke about. So once we started to build up awareness, we recognised there were key activities that we wanted to continue to do, like the South Pole, where they were not just good for awareness around these issues, but also for the veteran. Now, in doing those, we've recognised that they're actually great, but at the same time, we needed to do something more. We needed to continue to provide, I guess, more services, because it's good and well to take someone on a life-changing activity, but in doing that, it's a bit like a deployment. When you come back from that, where to from there? What's next? What is it? And you don't fall back into the daily humdrum without recognising that you're on a high versus coming back to, business as usual. So for us, it was, how do we do some activities, but do we actually do more things to help people through that transition? And the next phase, and the phase we started over 18 months ago, was around service delivery. So we have centres now around the country, in most places, or we partner with our friends at Mates and Mates or others to provide capability across the country. But we currently have a facility in Currumbin on the Gold Coast, Sydney at Concord Hospital, Parkville in Melbourne, here in Canberra, obviously, which is our largest centre at Crace. We're re-establishing a new facility in Adelaide around Torrens Parade Ground, and over at Floreat in Perth. And each of those facilities now provide 3 areas of support, which is mental health support, so psychologists are or will be in each of those centres very soon. Social connectedness, which is what we're really doing with those bigger scale activities, but doing them on a regular basis with coffee catch-ups, with activities such as yoga, music workshops, writing workshops, getting out and doing some of our sports recovery programs around cycling, surfing program we just partnered with Surfing Australia on, etc. And that's not, to be frank, about the activity. It's more about building a network of people that recognise what you've been through and working with you on that, so that you have a network, which you often lose when you leave the military. And then for us, the biggest push as an organisation is to support transition. And we don't mean just getting out of the military, or that's a key element. It's about that transition from military through into civilian life. And that may not be the first 6 months. It may be, in fact, many years or a lifetime. And providing that care and support, but also the empowerment of the individual and the family so that they can lead a successful life. And that's a key for us around partnerships with major corporates, funnily enough, defence industry especially, and providing also the family unit with employment and education opportunities so that they can honestly be the best part of society that they should be.
So it's an interesting journey that you've taken here at Soldier On, identifying one gap in the market, almost filling it, then seeing society gather round, understand that, then moving on to the next issue. And you talked a little bit about your the centres you have are located around the country and the transition. This is what's known as the Reintegration and Recovery Network. You've told us what it is. How's it going? Are there any success stories that you can highlight, obviously without going into any personal details, but it sounds like a very large endeavour for what is, a very young organisation. How is the journey with the Reintegration and Recovery Network going?
Yeah, look, it's going well. As an organisation, I guess we had huge goals and vision, and have been incredibly lucky through a huge amount of community support to be able to get there. And we would not have that network without support from so many organisations that decided to kick in. So currently we're sitting in a beautiful old building here that, with the other Robert Pote Centre here in Canberra, is provided to us at a peppercorn lease, as is all of our facilities around the country. And the network would not exist without that. The biggest success stories, I guess, are around the number of people who are accessing the services around the country. So it goes up and down, obviously, but we're looking at about 1,000 interactions a month at this stage around the country of veterans and families. And the thing that we're noticing is that we see some people come and then they don't come for a while. And we initially thought that, what's happening? Is that bad? Actually realising that they're getting what it is they need. They're building a network which they can utilise outside. They're coming and seeing the psychologist and talking through whatever it is they need to talk through. And then they're empowered to get on with whatever it is that they want to get on with. So in that aspect, we're not, rebuilding another institution. We're actually providing a pathway to that successful life. So that's fantastic. And we've got plenty of, those rich stories of talking to people and seeing people as part of the activities, and seeing them grow and connect. And I think one of the biggest ones for me was when we did our first ever surfing activity. Again, it's not about the surfing, it's much more than that. But surfing it does have some evidence base from the US around its importance for veterans. It's actually mindfulness, really. But seeing at the end of that, one of the family members come up to us and say, look, we haven't been on a holiday since 2008. We haven't actually got more than 100 k's from home because we always have an argument and it turns into not a very nice trip, and then we turn around and go home. This is the first time because my partner knew that he was coming to a place where other people would get him, where he could talk openly and honestly, and where we would be supported. And that has allowed us to come and do this. And I've just noticed a complete change in him and the whole family. And plenty of stories like that. And the great thing about the network is it's not just a one-off. It's about that continuation then of that support. And the big thing that the network's moving to now is so what? So yes, we've got you to a point where you're starting to engage with your family. You're feeling good. Now what? Is the role you have in society, is that the one you want, or could it be better for you? And the big one we're pushing for is volunteering. I think most veterans, and it might sound a little bit American, you join up to serve in some way, shape or form. Maybe serve's the wrong word. You join up to give back in a way. I think a lot of people think that as soon as you take the uniform off, you lose that. You don't have that permission almost to give back. That's not true. And what we're providing now is opportunities for veterans to volunteer. And we piloted this last year in Timor-Leste. We had a small group of veterans that went over and helped rebuild a clinic over there, the Birapiti Clinic, and an element of that clinic. And for them, that was not just an opportunity to go over and look, but it was go over to see what they did when they were veterans themselves of that conflict, and then to continue to give back. And they still are giving back now. So they've just sent over a pallet load of medical supplies to this clinic. They're getting others to be able to do that. And that's what we're going to do domestically as well. So that I think the best way of healing and of recovery and of finding your place in society is recognising that if you wore the uniform, it's not generally about you. It's about your team, your mates, and wider society. So giving veterans that opportunity to continue to give back, I think, is key, and that's where the network's going.
It's an interesting point you made about that anecdote of the family and the veteran understanding that this was going to be a different holiday for him because he'd be talking to people that got him. And also talking about the veterans who went off to East Timor, rebuild a clinic, continued to give back to the community they're still able to achieve. In the intro to the show, I talk about these warriors being broken but not defeated by war. And we've seen recently there's been pushes on two sides of what I consider the same coin. There's the valorisation of veterans, which some have criticised as being too much, others have criticised as being not enough. And then on the other side of the coin, we talk about the victimisation of veterans, which has also been criticised as being too much or not enough. Do you find that working with veterans and working with the wider community to educate them about veterans, that there is this misunderstanding that because someone has been to war, they must be a victim of what they have seen and done?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in society we look at the veteran today, a modern veteran, and actually see the veteran of 100 years ago. We are so ingrained in schools, especially learning about Gallipoli, learning about the First World War and such, that we do not link that to the veteran who currently serves and their family. And the viewpoint on what you must have gone through is very much around trenches and enemy facing this way and artillery bombardment and such. And if we don't change that mindset, I think you'll fall into what happened in Vietnam in a different way. And where the Vietnam generation was shunned by society, I think this one is inadvertently almost being forgotten because they're not understood. And as much as on Anzac Day, people take the time during the dawn service and later during the parade to remember, it shouldn't just be about remembering those that have gone 100 years, 50, etc. years ago. It should be about remembering who is there amongst them who has served. And it's not about hero worship. It's not about over-valorising. I know in the US it's thank you for your service and those kind of things. But if you cut below that, I think in the US environment, there's actually not much substance to it. It's an easy throwaway tagline so that your coffee is 10% cheaper or you get on the airline first or second. That's nice, but I think it has to go beyond that. It has to be a real deep respect. And I think that's what veterans want. They don't want to be lauded. They just want society to respect their service because ultimately it's not about you in the military. Well, I think that's a general rule. It's about, your unit. You are some part of a total. So you don't want to be singled out as a hero. You want the thanks for your mates and what you did as part of your overseas and or training and or whatever it is that constitutes your service. On the other side of that is for those that have been impacted by their service, you are almost immediately typecast as a victim. And this has been a significant thing, I think, since Soldier On's come about, and it has been an inadvertent element, I guess, of our success. We were trying to highlight to society that if you send people overseas to war zones and even to non-war-like locations, there is still elements of risk which will impact someone. But that doesn't mean negatively only impacts. There can be positive impacts, and I think that's often forgotten. And I'm almost sick and tired of when I do an interview now. So you're a veteran, so you've got PTSD as well. So no, I do not have PTSD. I saw no combat whatsoever. Yes, I'm still a veteran. Cavalry do not ride horses into battle anymore. We don't have trenches. I think there just has to be a general education, and it's not through ignorance of society. Ultimately, I think society, I know society wants to support veterans. Soldier On would not exist without it. But it's about making sure that, and the onus is on Soldier On, but the onus is also on veterans, to make sure that we don't let ourselves be typecast as victims. And so for us over the next 12 months especially, it's going to be nuancing that conversation in our society so that the veteran is recognised for their skill set. For those that have been impacted by the service and, as you say, broken but not defeated, giving them the empowerment so that they can get to the point where they can continue to be a part of and serve that society. So the last thing we want to see is victims' charity, doled out to veterans because, you're broken and you're going to somehow take your life. It's those kind of messages that need to be changed. And we honestly thought that there was lots of organisations, I guess, that were going to change those messages. But I don't think it's about the organisations. I honestly think it's also about the veteran and veterans and what you're doing, Mick. I applaud you because you're starting to change that conversation about what a veteran is. And your listeners, hopefully, as well, can go out there and talk about this because, I'm just one of, and the organisation can do some great stuff. But the more veterans that we have talking about what their experience was, will start to break down these images of 100 years ago and also the image that every single veteran is broken, because that's just not true.
It's a rather poignant statement to address our veterans and remind them that we're also responsible as veterans for the way that we're perceived in the wider public. I know when I walk down the street, I don't necessarily want someone to come up and say, thank you for your service. I just don't want them to look at me differently just because I'm a veteran. And we can, at times, self-perpetuate. It's called self-fulfilling prophecy for those who haven't done any school-level psychology. I won't say it too loud just in case the resident psychologists start calling me a charlatan. Self-fulfilling prophecy is something that we all need to be aware of, and even veterans are sometimes guilty of framing ourselves and defining ourselves in ways that we don't want to define ourselves. Now, John, it's been a pretty heavy topic so far, so it's time to get into the most serious part of the Dead Prussian podcast, and that is continuing our philosophical journey to understand what war is. Just like Big Carl did over 100 years ago, in fact over 200 years ago. Well, he started writing over 200 years ago, it didn't actually get published until a bit later, but the point is, regardless of whether or not he finished his book, like many of us aspiring writers out there, he sought to rationalise and understand war. All my guests come on the show, they pay the price, and that is defining what war is. You're unique compared to some of my previous guests. I won't say unique actually, because that probably makes you feel more special than you are. You are one of a few guests that I've had on that have actually been to war, and therefore your definition of war has a different perspective than, say, some of the academic guests I have. However, All guests are appreciated on this, the most outstanding of podcasts about war. Without further delay, John, can you finish the sentence, war is?
A societal decision that requires a societal responsibility. And by that what I mean is that ultimately, whether that be as it is now or as it was, we as a community decide to go to war. As much as that responsibility may reside with the Prime Minister, we own that as a country. And therefore, we also own the risks, the inherent risks of war, and have a responsibility for those that return who are impacted and need additional support so they can reintegrate back into our society. So I guess my answer is obviously very much toned with the organisation and slightly with my own experience. But I think it's important. I guess I'm borrowing a little bit of James Brown's recent article, monthly, and I think that's quarterly even. And I think that's really important, that it is a societal decision to go to war, because after war, it is a lifelong responsibility to support those who went. It is not something that you can brush up in 2 to 3 years and close the book on. And it is generational as well. The Vietnam veteran generation and their children have so many more mental health and physical ailments than the average population. So these questions of when and how and then what we do afterwards when it comes to war cannot be and should not be taken lightly. They need a community response and a community understanding that we do decide to go to war, we have a duty and a responsibility to support those that come back.
Now, that was an excellent definition of war, but the bit I like the most is that I can fit the start on a little Twitter blurb, and we can get the Twitter army discussing it. It's a very, very interesting concept, and I think a lot of our listeners out there who've obviously shown an interest in studying war and warfare, whether or not they're the history buffs or the policy makers trying to understand how some veterans think and how some veterans talk on podcasts, a societal decision and has a societal responsibility. That is a great little Twitter line for me. Please check out the Soldier On website. It has all the details of what the organisation is up to. They also have a ball here in August, 27th of August I think it is, and if you get yourself a ticket for that, you'll be able to see just what level of support the organisation has in the nation's capital. All right, before you turn off your phone, just make sure you open up your iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, Libsyn, go to the review section of your app. If it's a star-based system, just pull a couple of stars out of your pocket, maybe 5, maybe 4, preferably 5. Throw them the Dead Prussians' way, and that helps us extend our conversation and reach a wider audience on topics as important as veterans and modern veterans issues. John Bale, CEO for Soldier On, thank you very much for coming on the show.
A real pleasure, Mick, and congratulations to you and to your listeners for taking on such topics that I think only a few years ago were felt only to be outside of the professions of arms, ironically, and I think now it's really important that as part of the professional development of the Defence Force, and in this instance, I guess, with your experience, the Army, making sure that all leaders at all levels understand that there is a history to warfare, and it's really important to understand it if you're going to practice it.
All right, listeners, that's all from the Dead Prussian today. Until next time, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.